On BBC Question Time, the crisis in children's mental health in Britain was put before the panel by one father who shared his story.
Children's mental health services are in crisis, with over 270,000 young people awaiting support in England. As a parent that waited over 2 years for a referral, what action needs to be taken to support what is fast becoming another lost generation?
Gosh, Shay, so you mentioned you were a parent of a child that's waited over 2 years for referral. Do you mind, if you're happy to, telling us a bit about that?
Yeah, so we went from we had my youngest child bounding into school every day, head child at school, to overnight, once getting COVID, turning into a completely shadow of a self-crippling anxiety, not even being able to leave the house sometimes. 2 years waiting for CAMHS to even get a conversation led us to many, many frustrations. We took a private route. We were lucky that we could actually pay for private care, load up our credit cards, as many people. I dread to think of people who couldn't be in that position to do that. Went through all of that route. We're now 3 or 4 years on, and the care is patchy. It's uncoordinated. Unless you find someone who is exceptional, which we're very lucky in Bexley that we have found a very talented care worker, then I think it's completely inconsistent across the country, which really does worry me. There's still no end to this. It's every day we're dealing with it, but it could change overnight. But at the moment, I think where we worry about the lack of funding that's coming through, we worry about the fact that we just don't know what's going to happen tomorrow.
Associate editor of The Telegraph and GB News presenter Camilla Tominey responded by putting the blame for rising levels of emotional distress amongst young people squarely on our devices.
If you study the impacts on children of smartphones, this was happening back in around 2012. There was a slow creep of issues being suffered by children and adolescents as a result of being online. Lots of work has been done on it by a great many people, including Dr. Jonathan Haidt, who's written The Anxious Generation. You look at any of the graphs, and up they go when it comes to children suffering from anxiety, children self-harming. Something has happened that communications between, frankly, adults and children have broken down. It's not just children on screens, it's also parents on screens. The argument is that we are overprotecting them in the offline world and underprotecting them in the online world.
And Tominey was backed up by Conservative MP Richard Holden.
For children, it's even more ever present. It used to be a case of perhaps if children were facing problems at school, at least at the school gates the sort of issues could stop. Whereas with the always online presence of smartphones, I think is a real concern for a lot of parents.
A trader and friend of Novara Media, Gary Stevenson, had a different take on the issue.
I think we need to talk about the unbelievably hostile circumstances young people face with regards to their economic futures. More and more young people growing up in poverty. But even aside from that, we've got people with jobs in London who are homeless. So that means if you're a young person, you know that even if you get an ordinary job, it's not going to be enough to buy a home. It's not going to be enough to have a family. So just doing the right thing, working and getting a job, it doesn't even guarantee you can feed your kids. You know, we have to look at this. And then obviously if you're a young person, you're thinking, well, if I don't get the best grades and I don't get to the best university, then I'm not even going to be able to have a family. You know, what kind of world have we made here? You know, we need to look at we always look at the individual. This person has a mental health problem. This person has a mental health problem. It doesn't come out of nowhere. These people don't just suddenly get sick. My dad worked for the post office and he had a family and he bought a house and he has a retirement, he has a pension. Kids can't get that. Kids can't get that. Unless they make millions of pounds, they can't even have a family. It's ridiculous, you know. It's not just a problem for individuals, it's a societal problem. We need to make sure young people have economic opportunity.
Out of every guest on the panel, only Gary was willing to trace a line between an increase in emotional suffering amongst young people and the material conditions of the vast majority of the children in the UK find themselves in. where working hard at a job doesn't mean you'll ever be able to afford a home of your own or even have a family or even move out of your parents' home, where public services, including those aimed at enriching the lives of young people, such as youth clubs and art programs, are cut to the bone, and so many of the employment options offer are deeply unsecure and exploitative, young people aren't just reckoning with the far-reaching consequences of austerity. They've lived through a global pandemic in some of their most formative years and are growing up under the shadow of a climate emergency which threatens all life on Earth. There used to be an expectation that children would have better lives than their parents, and this is no longer the case. A recent study from YouGov, published last month, shows that just 15% of Gen Zs in the UK feel they have greater financial security than their parents did at the same age. 43% feel they are less financially secure, and over half of 18 to 27-year-olds feel they are less happy than their parents were at their age. Just over double the 24% who believe they are happier than their parents. So sure, tech giants are profiting from the capture of young people's attention and enhanced feelings of anxiety and dissatisfaction, but the social contract has broken down for young people, and not just Gen Z, but many millennials too. Just look at the property gap. Intergenerational wealth and asset inequality is well documented. This is from the Resolution Foundation's 2023 audit. Total net wealth in Britain has surged in recent decades, from around 3 times GDP in the mid-1980s to over 7 times GDP on the eve of the pandemic, and growing by £5.9 trillion in real terms between 2006-2008 to 2018-2020. Older age groups have been the largest beneficiaries of this wealth increase. For example, the typical person in their early 60s in 2018-20 had nearly £170,000 more wealth than their counterparts of the same age in 2006 to 2008. In comparison, the typical person in their late 30s in 2018-20 had almost £30,000 less wealth than those of the same age in 2006 to 2008. The report continues. These gains to older age groups can be explained by the distribution of the post-financial crisis wealth increases among birth cohorts. Around 40% of the £5.9 trillion increase in wealth between 2006-8 and 2018-20 went to cohorts born between 1956 to 1965, those in their late 50s and early 60s in 2018-20, and another 33% went to those cohorts born between 1966 and 1975. So, there's plenty of wealth, but it's been concentrated in the asset-rich older people. Yes, roughly 1 in 5 UK pensioners live in poverty, but 1 in 4 live in households with assets of worth more than £1 million. And on average, pensioners have more disposable income than working people. So Aaron, how would you suggest combating the high levels of dissatisfaction, anxiety and hopelessness amongst young people? And is Gary Stevenson bang on the money?
Well, Gary Stevenson's very much on the money. And I find Camilla Tominey's response in particular rather weird. I mean, I say that as somebody who doesn't think that mobile phones should be in schools. I think there should be a national prohibition on mobile phones being in schools. Not that it should be left to schools and the school to enforce. That's very hard. Just shouldn't be taking them into school. And then, of course, if none of your mates are on a phone between 9 and 4, why would you go on your phone? There's a conversation to be had as well about just being able to buy phones, maybe for under 12s or under 14s. That's a separate conversation, an interesting one. There's lots of really interesting data about how this is very bad for mental health outcomes amongst young people. I'm very open to that. I certainly don't think these things should be in schools. And people say, well, how can their parents get in touch? Their parents can call the school. That's what we used to do when we had the old rotation phones that might as well have been from the 19th century. So she's right about that. But she's saying that in response to somebody who's asserting that they had to wait for 2 years for their daughter to get, by the sounds of it, to see a consultant. To get the right mental health treatment that they required. That's a question about resources, healthcare, the NHS, etc. in this country, which, by the way, is a complete lottery. It's a complete lottery when it comes to mental health. You know, I'm somebody who's had depression, anxiety, and the past incredibly bad. I had it for years, and it finally took the right GP in the right place to sort me out, and then boom, it was like the key that just changed everything. But it shouldn't be like that. And of course, a lot of that is because of a system of rationing and resource deficits. So the idea that, well, we shouldn't have phones in schools and that'll sort everything out. If somebody's in the system, they're trying to get to see a consultant, it's taking them 2 years, they're having to go through private healthcare providers, etc. You're answering a different question, Camilla. So I take the schools thing seriously with phones. Clearly, we need to be spending a lot more on mental health funding. Not, by the way, great story on the Novara Media website today. Not, by the way, outsourced services, because we spend a ton of money for really crap outcomes. But fundamentally, Gary is right that you can have really well-resourced, well-funded mental health care. You can ban mobile phones in schools. But if the world we're presenting to young people is crap, you're sort of pissing in the wind, as people like to say, or window dressing is perhaps a more polite way of putting it. You're pissing in the wind, right? The reason why I developed the depression I spoke about a moment ago is because I moved 15, 16 times in 15, 16 years, right? It made me incredibly, incredibly miserable. Living with that level of precarity was incredibly difficult. On reflection, it was really stupid to carry on doing what I did for so long. And if you're a strong person, you think you can do really hard things like that. And in a way, your strength becomes your weakness because you abuse what should be that source of strength and resilience. You abuse it because you have it. And I was incredibly resilient, but I abused it. I took it for granted and I cracked. And that can happen to anyone. So I think given the state of the labour market we've got, I think given the housing market we've got, besides, of course, the issues you're talking about there, Helena, the future of the jobs market, you can take any job right now. Is it going to be there, particularly for white collar industries? Is it going to be there in 20 years' time? It's a really, really live question. You can talk about climate change, aging demographics. Right now, we do not have a future on offer to young people. We don't. We have, by the way, pensions in this country are very ungenerous, and we need a big conversation about them. But I find personally the triple lock a ridiculous policy. It means a permanent transfer of wealth from working age population to retirees. Now, 70% plus of retirees are sitting on really valuable assets. Maybe you can keep the triple lock if you start to tax those assets, right? If you have some sort of a land tax, perhaps, of course. But fundamentally, I look at something like the triple lock, and then I look at how little is going to mental health care, the kinds of services you mentioned a moment ago, Helena, about after schools activity, after hours activity for kids. There's a big deficit there. Now, there's a really big deficit there. I personally think this is going to really come to fruition over the next 10 to 15 years. We're really screwing with multiple generations of kids. I think really badly. And it's going to have appalling consequences for them and society more broadly. I do think that phones, social media, sure, it's a part of it, but it's just one part of it, And I'll finish with this. We live in a terraced house and we've had HMOs built either side of us. And what really made something click for me, Helena, was when all the young boys working on one of the HMOs next door, turning a 3-bedroom house into, 6-unit HMO, all the boys working, that young boys, all lived in HMOs themselves. And I thought, what kind of a future is that for young people, right? You're going to live in a little box and you're going to turn what were family homes or maybe flats that friends could live in, you're going to turn those into more boxes. It is depressing. If you're depressed, that's the rational response, right? So I think Gary's absolutely spot on. And I think he's going to play a really central role in the years ahead in making sense of all this, because he talks about these really fundamentally important issues in a register everyone can understand. And let's be honest, the left hasn't always done that.
What this really does for me is show, again, just the false economy of austerity. We've stripped back all of the public realm that exists to maintain both physical and mental health of our population. We stripped it away, took it away. And then, of course, the people who grew up in poor backgrounds and the areas that have been hit hardest by this, their mental health is even worse than elsewhere in the country, And once we've done this to these people, they then fall out of the jobs market. We then put them on a waiting list for mental health care. That's been stripped away by austerity too, so they stay out of the job market forever. So we've destroyed productivity, we've destroyed people's lives, we've made people sicker and more unhappy, and then we take away their benefits, we take away their mental health welfare payments and pay all the ways down the line, right? Even more austerity on top, which is all downwind of the fact that we wanted to cut costs early on to try and save money in the future, which didn't work. In fact, it's more money in future. There's a great line from Mariana Mazzucato when she was on Question Time months and months ago now, saying that the cost of inaction is greater than the cost of action, and that's the legacy. That's the legacy of Osborneism, of that period of ultra low interest rates where we could have put these things in place and we just didn't, and we've screwed over an entire generation of people because someone got some numbers wrong on a spreadsheet in 2010. It's real damning indictment on what's happened to this country and what we've done to people with all of the experimentations with these kind of crackpot economic policies of the broad neoliberal consensus in this country. And there's a reason. There's a big reason why it's just Gary. There's multiple times, I think it's 3 times this year, we've talked about mental health on Question Time. I watch it every week on stream. And at no point has any of the panelists at all thought, maybe it's the material conditions for once. I know, obviously, as a Marxist, I say it's the material conditions for everything. But surely, if it's anything, it's this. And none of the other panelists at any point have mentioned material conditions. It's been phones, it's been social media, it's been whatever. And those points may have some salience, but how can you ignore shit life syndrome and the results of the economic strategy of governments for the last 45 years that have led us to this point? And the journalists won't tackle it for 2 reasons. First of all, because they don't live it. They're living in London, they're living on journalist salary, living the life of Riley, getting paid handsomely by Sky or by GB News. They're taking their Paul Marshall money, and they are not having to worry about what it's like for people who are on the bottom rung dealing with these problems. And second of all, these self-same journalists, they co-signed austerity. They co-signed George Osborne's economic lunacy year after year after year. Always a genius. We must apply this medicine to the country. I was quote tweeting Nick Ferrari saying, "Why is everything stuck in this country?" Well, you in 2011, you said we should do austerity. It's people like you that manufactured consent for this terrible economic policy that has left our country in this threadbare state that it's in outside of the Southeast. And now everything's coming home to roost. And if they acknowledge that for 1 second, that it's a material problem and not a problem that's just happening because of the phones and the state of technology, they'd have to look in the mirror and realize that they co-signed this and they are partially to blame for why we are here at the end of everything, And unfortunately, it's going to take a lot to fix those problems. And I don't think Labour are up to the task because they want to continue with the same kind of short-term policy, the sticking plaster politics that Keir Starmer so often derides in his political speeches, And so I don't have much hopes, but there is always more to come. We shall see where we end up. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me this evening, Aaron.
I just want to quickly say 2 things, Helena, if that's okay. The first is, what a host. We need to do this more often. And then secondly, on housing, I bought a modest, like I say, terrace house, not in London, with my wife several years ago. And I remember about 5 or 6 weeks later thinking to myself, why do I feel so not even happy? I felt like a burden had been lifted off my shoulders. And it's because I wasn't living at the behest of the London housing market, which is awful. And you know what? Since then, I get to know neighbours, I get to know local businesses, and I try to give cash to local businesses which are a little bit more moral. Maybe they're worker-owned, or they're small businesses and it's owned by family, or they look after their employees, etc. You get to know people, or their products have great supply chains, and you can be a part of something and you can contribute to it, and you can build that word that politicians love to talk about, community, but which they're locking out for millions of young people in this country. And so that, for me, Helena, was, again, another realization. And I'd also say, this isn't about the ideology of the journalists, left, right. It's just as bad with BBC journalists. It's just as bad with, elite Guardian journalists as it is with somebody at the Mail or the Telegraph. Because as you've said, conditions determine consciousness, Helena. And these people, on the earnings they have, if they tend to be older in the journalism industry, let's be honest, younger ones much harder, they've done very well for themselves. They're sitting on a very valuable nest egg in London. And, it's very tempting to look at one's own success and say, it's all because of me, it's because I worked hard. It takes a very unique person to say, you know what, I got lucky. Maybe if I was young now, I'd be absolutely stuffed. And when I meet people like that who are very successful, I really admire them for it. There's not enough people like that in this country, certainly not many of them in journalism.